what we call the media capture model that we see in Hungary, in certain Balkan countries. What happens there? The government uses money from the state budget to build and seize power in the media system. For example, in Hungary, where I lived for a while and where I studied this system, the government uses money very often, which is ironic, from European funds. They move them to corporations that do other jobs, for example, in construction, where a lot of money goes. And then they use this new class of oligarchs to buy the press in Hungary, which they then, of course, control. Several people I interviewed, when they refer to journalists, they're actually talking about certain individuals. Influencers on the networks they visit and whom they consider journalists actually have nothing to do with journalism. But if you think about it, actually what happens and why the media isn't free in many countries, it all comes down to money. The moment you have financial corruption, editorial independence is completely gone.
Good evening, dear friends. It's good to see you again tonight with Ada Rossetti and Marius Dragomir. Ada. Marius.
Good evening.
Good evening. To begin with, let's say a few words about our guest this evening. Marius Dragomir is a director of the Center for Media and Journalism Research and a researcher at the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. He also recently received an award for media policy studies. He analyzes the funding sources of media organizations from all over the world. This is in the context that he earned his philology degree in Brasov last century. He worked in the local press in Constanza, then continued at Radio Europa Libera in Prague, and moved on to business journalism in London. Since 2004, she moved to the Open Society Foundation, and since then has been researching the media from a scientific perspective and observing what is happening internationally in this field.
Very nice, Marius. You led a study about how controlled the press is here. In simple terms, what did you discover? Are the news in Romania still free, or are they completely under political control?
Yes, that study actually, there were several studies. They were part of a bigger project. Pretty much all the projects we do are comparative. I don't think I can remember any study where we focused only on one country, only on one subject. And indeed, one of the conclusions of this study was that the news, I don't know if it's right to say, is no longer free. I don't know if it was ever really free. However, the problem is not just an issue of the Romanian press. This problem exists in many countries in Europe. And to narrow it down a bit, because if we start talking about the whole world, it will become very hard to keep up within the time of this interview. Returning to Europe, I think this problem exists in several countries. A lot of people have this idea, this myth that everything in Eastern Europe, like the press and the media and many other things, is very bad. When you go to the West, everything seems great, and there is some truth to that. The press in the West has a tradition. For example, in Great Britain, where I lived, the tradition of the British Broadcasting Corporation and public television exists. People paid for this service. There is indeed a tradition of independent press, but the truth is not exactly black and white. If we are to talk, for example, about corruption in the press, the British print media is one of the most corrupt sectors in the world. But returning to the subject of the press in Romania, I believe there is a major problem of independence in the Romanian press. I think there are very few media organizations left that actually practice independent journalism. You can count them on the fingers of one hand. And I think the problem comes from a lot of forms of control, many of them related to finances and the political element. Now, if you want us to talk a bit scientifically, we're working on a study that actually hasn't been published. And I've presented some conclusions at various conferences. But I think that in order to have an idea about what's happening in the Romanian press, it's important to see what kinds of journalism and mass media systems exist in Europe. And for now, we're conducting this study from the perspective of funding. We're trying to understand how free the press is by analyzing the sources of funding, where they come from and what happens, how much they affect independence, and the way journalists behave and do their job. And for now, we see four systems at the European level. One of them we call the public interest system. So it's a system, let's say, in which the press functions as an element of public interest, which we find in the Nordic countries, Finland, Denmark. In fact, I started with the best system, which many journalists are trying to achieve, where you have a very well-developed public television and broadcasting system, free from the political system, and a private media system just as well developed, where there is a lot of transparency. The advertising market works, so to speak, objectively, and where in fact there is the highest degree of independence. If we then move to the second system, it's the system we call corporatist, with technological influence. Because in recent years, many of these global companies like Meta and Google have taken over a lot of the advertising that used to go to the press and media organizations in these countries. In this system, which we find in countries like Belgium and many countries in Western Europe, France, usually there is a very good and independent public television. But in the other part of the press, you have a lot of influence from the owners, who are often connected not necessarily to political elements, but to corporate interests, to the interests of those who advertise. You still have a lot of independence in these countries, but it's not quite at the ideal we see in the Nordic countries. Then we move on to what we call the media capture model, which we see in Hungary and in certain Balkan countries, in which what happens? The government uses money from the state budget to build and seize power in the media system. I can give you examples if you want. For example, in Hungary, where I live for a while and where I studied this system, the government uses money very often, which is ironic. From European funds, they move them to corporations that do other jobs, for example, in construction, where a lot of money goes. And then it uses this new class of oligarchs to buy the press in Hungary, which they then, of course, subjugate. After 10 years of Fidesz power in Hungary, during which this form of control over the press was applied, we have enormous control of the state element, which is combined with a very powerful and very wealthy class of oligarchs. And in fact, in this system, you have very little independent press. You have, for example, ATL, ATSO, or Direct 36, two of the last media organizations that still manage to remain independent and do investigative work. So then the fourth system, I thought for a long time that there wasn't another one. This one of capture does exist, but the fourth one is where Romania also fits in. It's what we call the atomized system, where if you go there, you don't see capture, you don't see the element Viktor Orban in Romania, a force that seizes absolutely everything. But on the other hand, you see a lot of press headlines, a lot of news portals, and you get the impression that it's a very strong market with a lot of competition. But when you look closer at the ownership structures and once again at the sources of funding, which are the way we study the press, you notice that there are a lot of what is called in media studies instrumentalization. That is, many of these organizations do not exist to do their job as independent press. They exist to serve certain interests. Sometimes at the local level, for example, is the interests of local moguls, of local officials. At the national level is the interests of political parties. Very often you have situations where ministries or state organizations give money to these organizations. And of course, this influences the way they do their work from an editorial point of view. So in the end, when you look, in fact, it's a system that's atomized in the sense that there's a lot of press, but actually there's very little independent press. And once again, if we take a look, there are very few organizations at the national level that do this independent work. And sometimes you find at the local level, new young organizations have appeared that manage to do independent journalism work, but under very tough conditions, especially financially, because as we all know, it's very hard to build sustainability in the media, not only in Romania.
Marius, if I could continue here, let's say that the Nordic countries really do have a better model. They also have mechanisms that prevent the press from slipping into the latest trends. 3 and 4, which you talked about, so that the press isn't taken over by various, how should I say, interests. Are there any mechanisms that make this possible?
Yes, there are mechanisms, but not especially in the Nordic countries in particular. And in this sense, I had a discussion, I think about a year ago, at a conference on various media topics with a researcher from Finland, where we talked about the importance of having a body, a mechanism to monitor the regulatory bodies. For example, in Romania, we have the National Audiovisual Council, for example, and to have another totally independent monitoring body, which would see if the National Audiovisual Council is doing its job independently, as it should. And this colleague of mine from Finland looked at me and didn't understand the reason. In fact, this is one of the mechanisms proposed by the new IMFI, European Media Freedom Act, the new press freedom law in Europe. And he didn't understand why we need another mechanism, since we have democracy, and as we explained in Finland, the essential mechanisms by which we ensure press freedom are democratic mechanisms. People freely elect a parliament, that parliament represents their interests, and that parliament, from that parliament, regulatory bodies are accountable. They do their job independently because there's no other way, and because in fact they are accountable to the people, I would say, to the public's wishes. This is very hard to understand, and on the other hand, it's hard to understand for people who live in these systems. Why in other countries that don't have this tradition of a free press do we need another and another layer of monitoring? So coming back to the question, I think there are, of course, these mechanisms in the law, for example, the public television law. In these countries, it is stated very clearly that the political class and the government are not allowed in any way to put pressure on the editorial staff. But specific mechanisms, for example, to ensure press freedom, are only those that everyone listens to in one way or another.
You mentioned earlier that in our atomized system, city halls and ministries have money and can pay for advertisements. Does this influence which topics make it to television or the press in any form? And if so, what effect does this have on people? Is it okay for things to happen this way?
I think we need to make a very important distinction here between the positive role of the government, of the state in building a media policy and in creating a media system that is independent, and the negative role of the state, which intervenes and funds the media in order to control it. And of course, it does this to control the editorial message. It's very clear that in many countries around the world, the government funds culture, funds art. I don't think there's any other model. Of course, there are also private foundations and private organizations that do this. But there's nothing wrong with a situation where the government funds media, arts, and culture. However, when it does this, I think it's very important to have a set of, once again, mechanisms and a set of rules in which the government cannot intervene in the way journalists do their work. This doesn't really happen in very many countries. Once again, Romania is not a unique case. We see it in many other countries in the region. I mentioned Hungary, where the situation is much, much, much more serious. And yes, of course, so it matters a lot that how is this money distributed? Or what are actually the criteria by which organizations receive this money? And the normal result is that when these amounts of money go to certain media organizations, it's to influence them, the editorial position. It's very clear that it indirectly influences the public, because the public is the final consumer of media content. So clearly, I think there's no country where media organizations that are controlled from a financial point of view by state organizations don't influence the public in one way or another. If not, there's the situation where they don't have an audience. As I understand, in Romania, there's the situation of Televiziunea Română, which receives money from the state but doesn't have much of an audience. From what I know from the latest data,
Marius, according to the latest reports, many Romanians get their news from Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. How does that affect political discussions?
It actually has a very big impact. And I think that's a discussion we're having and a topic we're addressing in a lot of studies already, I think for more than a decade. Once again, it's not a problem isolated to a certain country. We see it pretty much everywhere. It depends a lot, of course, on many factors: the level of education, the political level, political integration, and political culture. So how people think, how they get their information, and how they filter and then process it depends on a lot of factors. So we could talk about this for a whole day. Coming back to this question, I did publish a study in May, I think, this year, in collaboration with the Thomson Foundation, which is actually present in the area in Romania, Bulgaria, in several countries. That the Thomson Foundation runs a lot of training programs for journalists. It also gives grants to media organizations, helping them stay independent. And they asked us to do a study in which we analyze exactly these issues. And what we did was analyze 4 population structures in the area. One was through direct interviews. There are various methods in our field of media studies and in sociology, interviews, focus groups, and so on. What we chose to do here was not to go with the option of a very extensive survey, which of course has its own value, because we actually tried to get to know these people better, to understand how they behave on social networks. So what we did was conduct interviews with TikTok users in the county, in Dobroje and in Bucharest. This also came after the elections in Romania, where we tried to see in which areas this network is used and where people voted and how. The second case study was in the area inhabited by the Hungarian ethnic group in Transylvania, where we analyzed the behavior of Facebook users in these regions. The third case study was on Hungary Facebook users in Hungary. And the fourth was on a sample of Twitter users, the X network in Poland. It was a very interesting project, as you can imagine, the way we discussed and changed the conclusions from the study. But to return to the very concrete question about what is happening in Romania, indeed, there are many things to say here. First of all, the study concludes this applies to many people. It doesn't really matter if it's the younger population or the less young, they're simply glued to social media. But in a way, we actually came up with a new term in this study, blind scrolling, which basically means you scroll through because there's so much content on social media. You lose track of time, but in a way that makes no cognitive sense. You just look, so to speak, like a fool at the networks nonstop, and you don't get anything out of it. There is a term in the specialized literature, actually there was, called doom scrolling, which means studied by other researchers. A situation where people spend a lot of time on social networks, and for some reason they search for and consume negative news. In one that increases their anxiety and the way they relate to the world, especially among TikTok users. Is this it? They simply sit for hours scrolling and consuming content without any meaning, without any purpose. I think that's exactly the point. The moment you have this, actually, we're talking here about another dimension, a more psychological dimension. We didn't have experts in psychology or media in this study, but that's probably something that should be studied. But this matters a lot because it greatly influences the way people get their information. First of all, think about what happens with people. Actually, we've all seen what happened in the elections. I think that's a very good example. Secondly, I talked to them a lot about how they see the press and how they perceive journalists. For the first time, that really shocked me. Because for the first time in my research career, I dealt with people who simply have trouble actually distinguishing journalism itself. People who, in fact, don't even know. Again, it's not just the case of Romania, who, in fact, don't understand what this field is. There are cases that I have documented in which several people I interviewed when they refer to a journalist, they actually mean certain influencer figures from the networks they visit and whom they consider journalists. In fact, they have nothing to do with journalism. I think in one area there was a man who does some kind of public relations for a political party, so absolutely nothing to do with journalism. There are many angles from which to look at this, and I think it's very clear that this has a huge influence on the way people perceive journalism and information. And as such, we see why so many people are so influenced by disinformation and fake content. On social networks,
deep fakes and articles made with artificial intelligence have already started to appear. What happens to us, to the public, if we can't tell them apart?
I think the discussion about artificial intelligence is very important, and I believe it's heading in many different directions. Even for us in the field, it's hard to understand which of these directions is actually very important. The answer to the question is clearly that at the moment when the population can't distinguish disinformation and all these fakes on social networks, there is a big problem in society. And the way society works, the way the electoral process works, the political process, and so on. The dangers are enormous. I think that on the one hand, I think it is what we actually lack, and what has happened with this rise of social networks, is what we call referentiality. There are a lot of researchers in our field who look back, who discuss, for example, a lot about how the press has changed. And in a way, when you look at what they write and when they talk about the destruction of the press business model in the 80s and 90s, you kind of get the feeling that they're nostalgic for those times. And often you get the sense that everything was very good in the 80s and 90s, not in Romania, in other countries, but also in Romania in the 90s. And suddenly with these social networks, everything changed and journalism is about to be destroyed and die. And I think that's not the case in this situation. What is very important is that before the internet, we had an imposed referentiality. Referentiality in the sense that people would go watch television for news or read newspapers. In communist Romania, you only had one option, but in Western countries, people could choose from more. But there was an element of referentiality. Journalism existed and had a status, and people knew they would go to a certain place to get their information. Now, of course, there are social networks that offer you much more information. Now, normally, we should think that, in fact, this diversity is a good thing and actually a way of social progress. People can communicate directly, political parties can communicate directly, they can communicate directly with those who vote for them. However, when you look at how technology companies use this data, I think that's where we have a very big problem. Because this algorithmic logic changes a lot the way information is brought to the public. And I think this will have a very big impact on the way people will act based on what they consume on social networks. A very important element, which is completely within my field of research, is education. The education system is essential. Very often we talk in our field about the phenomenon of disinformation, about why disinformation? Very often it is much more believed and has a much greater impact than information coming from a media organization that verifies the information. And the answer very often lies in the level of education. The way people from a very young age are prepared to consume and understand information. And I think that's actually where the answer is. Of course, it's not a long-term answer. That's a long-term solution. It's not a short-term answer, it's a long-term solution. In Romania, actually, there have been some very interesting initiatives for a few years now. The Center for Independent Journalism started certain initiatives many years ago to popularize media in schools. Also, I know that they organize courses for people of all ages, but I think these need to be institutionalized to somehow start in schools. Without this, Without a system to teach media studies from a very young age, I don't think we're going to get very far. Many times we conduct studies on fact-checking. We try to understand, for example, the impact of fact-checking organizations that now exist in many countries. And in fact, what these organizations do is tell the public, politician X said this is wrong. In fact, the information is here. But if you look deeper into certain places where this happens, where journalists or these organizations do this fact checking, you notice that in fact, a lot of people, very large layers of the population are, as it was said, functionally illiterate. In fact, you realize that those people don't actually understand any kind of message. So at a very deep level, you have a problem that the media itself and media studies cannot solve. I think the long-term problem needs to be solved at another level. But how do you build curricula? The media is completely at all levels. It's completely outside my area of interest, of expertise.
Along the same lines, if a headline or a piece of news seems suspicious, what could an ordinary person do before they believe it and share it?
Yes, I think that's a very interesting topic and question. And in fact, it's something that has personally concerned me for a very long time, because I have had projects and have been involved in various research projects that also had a practical side, so to speak, for about 2 or 3 years. I gave a series of lectures to several classes of students at Wittenberg University near Dortmund in Germany, which are focused exactly on this subject. How do people understand information and what should they know in order to realize if the information is, as you said, dubious or if it's not factual information, if the facts are wrong? And I think everything narrows down and goes once again to the financial and ownership element. No, but that's very hard. In other words, what I mean is that when you see a piece of news, a source of information, a headline, it would be very important and interesting to have a Chrome extension or a software on the internet that at that moment tells you where the information comes from. We study these ownership structures, these financial structures, and it's not just us. There are many universities that do this. So the information is there, stored, it exists in reports and studies. But I think what we should do in the future, and actually in the last few years, I've had some discussions with people in the field. We wanted to make, for example, an app, like a game where people could join and talk, exchange information about who owns what and where. Not just in the media, but it would be very interesting to know who owns things there and what their influence is. And I think once again, we did this game and this kind of seminar with students in Germany, and it was a great success. We were actually giving them a task for a week, a certain number of media outlets to see who owns them and who finances these media outlets. And then the question, and actually the work they were doing was to try to analyze the connection between sources of funding, ownership, and content to see if there is any correlation. And of course, in many cases, there is. So once again, to the question of what people should do, they should check where this information is coming from. I know very well that it's very hard and you can't expect people to do this for every headline they read in the press. Go somewhere to find out who provided the information, its source, and who funded it. In fact, it's very hard, but I think they should be more cautious with each one. Piece of information they come into contact with. To be realistic, I don't think we can expect such an attitude at the societal level. That's why I believe the answer lies more in discovering, thinking, and doing, to create certain systems through which information that provides transparency, sources of information, actually appear on the internet for everyone who accesses this data.
Because you're talking about sources of funding, there are organizations like Recorder or Press One that survive on donations in Romania. They do journalism based on donations made by citizens. From what the data shows, is it possible for this crowdfunding system to keep Romanian journalism afloat in the long run?
In the long run, I don't think so. It's a crisis situation or a temporary situation. At the same time, I think we need to think about and discuss the issue of the sustainability of the media sector in general so we can understand these phenomena. If we look at the last 10 years, actually, the press and media systems around the world in almost every country have suffered a lot for two reasons. The rise of new technologies, which has changed absolutely everything in the field. On one hand, this was also a very good thing because in countries, for example, where independent journalists couldn't operate due to a very captured media system, the internet actually gave them a place where they could express themselves and work. On the other hand, as we've seen in many studies conducted by various universities, the way technologies have expanded has had a huge influence on the media funding system. In other words, a large proportion of advertising money has shifted from the internet to these global technology companies, greatly affecting media organizations pretty much from everywhere. The second phenomenon was related to the series of financial and economic crises we've gone through. In fact, what happened in Eastern Europe? Why do we have this phenomenon of capture in countries like Hungary? Why did the oligarchs in Czechia, for example, manage to buy the press? Why did this happen in Slovakia? It's because after the crisis of 2007-2008, a lot of the press in the region suffered financially and became very vulnerable. At the moment when many companies, for example, from Germany sold everything and left, these groups were left behind and were bought by local oligarchs. So from this point of view, that's basically what we need to understand about the crisis in journalism. These days, I'm working on a new book with a group of researchers in this field of domination. The way technology companies dominate globally, not just in the media system. And in a chapter that I edited, there's a discussion exactly about this topic. What is happening with journalism and where does it need to go? And their argument is that we somehow need to forget about this advertising model because journalism has always been in great tension with the advertising element. The press needs to make a profit, and that's when you have big problems. Because especially in the context where you have capture and where you have very powerful oligarchs or government intervention, turning a profit is tough without compromises, especially editorially. And then the second purpose of journalism, which is to serve the public interest, the two don't really go together. And in many cases, even in the last century, and in many Western European countries where media organizations tried to do both things, they often had problems. So I think I agree with their argument as well. I think we somehow need to forget about this commercial model and try to think more about how to reposition journalism as a publicly funded product. Now, public funding, we discussed earlier, they are a big problem in a country where you have mechanisms, where you don't have transparency, where you don't have very clear criteria, where you give these funds to media organizations. So there's a lot to discuss there. But back to the question of crowdfunding and how, for example, a media organization like Recorder in Romania can finance itself in the long term. Crowdfunding is temporary, but it's good it exists. In fact, if this phenomenon of donations from the public didn't exist, a lot of the press we know wouldn't exist right now. But in the long run, I think what needs to happen is for it to develop more. The membership and subscription system, there's a kind of subscription where people pay for media content. This is difficult, but it's been done. Denikan is one example. In Slovakia, there is a news portal created by a group of journalists who left the SME newspaper. In Slovakia, after a financial group bought it, they realized they'd be controlled, so everyone left and formed Denikan, which is currently very profitable and is profitable only based on a certain number. I don't know how much it is now. They actually became profitable when they had 23,000 paying subscribers. So I think that's part of the solution. That connection between you and the audience also needs to exist financially. it's very hard to imagine a media organization staying independent without the support of the public. And in the long run, I think we need to think very, very clearly about a model that brings journalism back into the public sphere. But for that, especially in countries from Eastern Europe, it's very hard to manage to achieve this goal.
Speaking of that, Brussels is launching the new European Media Freedom Act. Will someone from Cluj or Iași actually feel any concrete change after it comes into effect?
The short answer is no. The long answer is complicated, but again, it's just a longer form of no. Well, what is happening with the European Media Freedom Act? On one hand, it is the most, I'd say, is control. The most advanced form of media legislation I have seen in the European Union, and the most courageous, if I can put it that way. In the past, very often when we do these studies, we are invited to Brussels or various parliaments in Europe, and we talk with those who deal with public policies, who ask us we share our European systems and recommendations, but often after the experts leave, little changes. At the European level, we were invited a few times to discussions and consultations with other experts. And when I looked at the final form of the law, I realized we all saw that it was clear there was a very strong interest from the progressive side at the European level to make a law that would somehow change things in Europe. If you look closely at the main points and the main articles of this law, they attack very much, let's say, these components of media capture. In a study we did a few years ago, in collaboration with other colleagues, we noticed that this capture, in order to identify media capture in a media system, we observed 4 elements that repeat themselves. The first is the control of regulatory bodies, which is quite easy because governments and authorities have the right to choose people for these commissions. The second element is control of public television is easily achieved in many European countries using the same method. The third element is the use of public funds. In many countries, it's in the form of state advertising. In Romania, as I understand it, it's in the form of funds given to political parties and then channeled to media organizations. The use of these public funds to control the media. And the fourth element is the takeover of many private media organizations. In other words, to buy as many private media organizations as possible. The best example, once again, is Hungary, where all of this happened very systematically. From the moment Fidesz and Viktor Orban won back the elections in 2010 and haven't lost them to this day. Now, when we think about European legislation, if you look, I repeat, at the European Media Freedom Act, it addresses exactly these 4 issues, which is a very good thing. However, when I analyze the law a bit, there are 2 major problems that make me think it won't have much influence. And we all know that we've known it for 20 years, ever since we've been discussing and offering our recommendations to the European Commission. The first element is the lack of implementation and enforcement mechanisms. So we have this law, and then this law will have to be adopted at the national level by the parliament in Budapest, in Bucharest, in Bratislava, in Praga, and turned into national legislation. At that point, we're lost, because what will happen? This European legislation has a normative character. It tells you roughly what the principles are. But when you get to the national level, what happens? It's what we all call business as usual. I put it that they adopt exactly what the European Union wants, but when it comes to implementation, they will continue to do exactly what they've done so far. To choose regulatory bodies based on political criteria, to allocate public funds based on political criteria, and so on. The second problem with the law is that it doesn't address the fact, it addresses the fact that it is legislation. It addresses concrete issues that have to do with media capture. And most concretely, the problem is actually financial corruption. In fact, I think that's where it all starts if we really think about it. And this is a study we want to do at some point. If you consider why the media isn't free in many countries, it ultimately comes down to financial corruption. Editorial independence is completely gone. I gave you the example of Hungary, which I find to be an absolutely ridiculous and unbelievable situation. I find it unbelievable that the European Union accepts this. Of course, there is a lot of criticism about what is happening in Hungary, but I find it incredible that one person and one party can use public money, send it to private organizations that buy up the country's media, which then serves the government. So in fact, with the money, these people in power create their own system. People are actually paying for their own capture. So at the moment, these problems are not addressed at all by this law. And I understand I've had many discussions when I was asked, for example, specifically, how would you solve this problem? I told them, why don't you introduce in this law articles that state, for example, very specifically, in European countries, companies that take public contracts over a certain amount, this needs to be discussed. The details can be discussed by experts. These companies are not allowed to own media outlets. At that moment, there was silence in the room. And of course, no one listened and no one discussed this proposal anymore. Because there are a lot of interests involved there. For example, one of the most vocal critics of this proposal was the press industry in Germany, because the big press corporations in Germany were afraid that once you start with these, if you introduce these disqualification rules in the media, at some point indirectly, it might affect, for example, their sources of funding from certain fields. And of course, at that moment, a lot of interests started to appear, and these recommendations were buried. When you don't address this issue, I believe that, in fact, you're not addressing anything. A colleague a few days ago was telling me, when we were talking about how big of an impact this law will have. When you look at the law, it seems to be written by someone who lives in Luxembourg, who actually doesn't know what's happening in this part of Europe. And everything seems just fine. The idea is, and what's important is that those in national governments should take that law with vision and harmonize it into national legislation. With effect, I mean, they should really believe in it and find ways for the legislation to have an impact. That won't happen. In Western European countries, the legislation is useless because many countries don't need such mechanisms. They won't be applied in Eastern European countries. In my opinion, because there is no way to force these countries to apply or introduce mechanisms to ensure the independence of media regulators in any way.
We're returning to a more practical question. We have guests on the podcast who are researchers from many fields, including this one, which is a complex field. They all ask us how they could explain complicated things in such a way that they reach the people they want to talk to. Whether it's politicians or the general public, well, what recommendations would you make based on the research done in your field?
Yes, sure. I think the recommendations are pretty simple. I don't have any kind of advice that would revolutionize this field. On one hand, I think researchers from many fields need to communicate much more often. Many of them, and also many colleagues from our field, are somehow stuck in the university system. They publish their research in academic journals, which are often not accessible. In fact, accessing academic journals is very expensive if the articles are not open to the general public. This problem has existed for a long time. It still exists, but things are changing. I think the first recommendation is to communicate more. There is, for example, a publication called The Conversation. It was founded many years ago. I was in London when it began, working for Open Society, and spoke with its founder, who then only had the idea. A journalist who was based in Australia. In the meantime, it has expanded a lot. And what does this publication want to do, which now I think has a very large audience and I believe has a very solid funding model? Because it has attracted many universities that not only provide content, but I think also finance it in certain ways. What happens here is that when you have a study, you write it, a very short text, accessible and easy for everyone to understand, where you actually explain what the implications of this study are and why it is important. And actually, when you go to this site, it's very easy to understand in any field you want what it's about and what these people are doing and why what they do is important. That's the main recommendation, and it's nothing unusual. It's just that I find it ordinary for people in this field to communicate more, to write blogs, to write wherever they can, and to try to explain in very simple language what they do and what the conclusions of their work are. The second recommendation would be to somehow get out of this academic blockage. For example, what we did as a center, of course, the only solution is to open our center online to anyone who wants to see what we do. It's a private social network which avoids other complications. When you're public, you have to be careful about a lot of legal things. But actually, it's a shared space where we communicate with each other about the studies we're doing. We launched it very recently, but we opened it though. So anyone who wants to join this network just needs to apply. They need to give us some information like name and contact, because we don't want chatbots or other things to penetrate the network. It's very important for people to speak very freely. And where people can actually see what we're doing, they can have access to the databases. Very often we tell them, we've started this study, here is all the data, we're still collecting it. Please don't share them, or only share them with friends and trusted people. But don't publish them because we haven't checked them yet. When they're verified, we'll let you know. Here's the full study and all databases. Do whatever you want with them. We gave people access to see what's happening in this field. Of course, it's a very small example, but what I want to say here is that it's not the only solution. But what I want to emphasize is that it's important during the research process not to stay silent for 4 years and say nothing until you finally publish a study or a scholarly article. Meanwhile, always inform the public about your actions. If you want to have, of course, as you were saying, an audience and for people to truly be interested in what you're doing.
Marius, you've worked across Europe but grew up in Romania. What still surprises you about the Romanian press when you return?
I think we've already talked a lot about these aspects. It's not that it surprises me. What surprises me is that the press hasn't grown professionally and editorially. I had a very interesting experience 2 or 3 years ago. I was invited to write a chapter about how the Romanian press contributed to the democratization of Romania. And it was a moment, I think the only time in the last 20 or 30 years when I actually had a year to go back and see what happened with the press in Romania. And I took each period, I analyzed, I discovered that I, just like in the post-December history of the Romanian press, divided it into 3 periods. The first period, when there was enthusiasm and total freedom, when it really existed. I worked back then, I was very young. And I know it was like that. You could do absolutely whatever you wanted, and you could publish, unfortunately, many times things that weren't verified. It's total freedom. This is the second period in which this combination between politics and business has appeared in Romania. Many journalists entered politics, and many businessmen started buying and increasing their influence over the press, which started to have negative effects on the editorial. And then the period we are living in today, which goes back to the discussion we had at the beginning about atomization and the increasing loss of editorial independence. What surprises me when I come to Romania and look around, and of course I still read all the time, and when we do these studies, especially content studies, I go and read and see what it's all about. I'm not necessarily surprised by anything in particular. It surprised me when I stopped to think about it, and that's it. It's actually something that a colleague from Bucharest at the University of Bucharest pointed it out to me and told me to look very carefully. In a discussion, I mentioned that when I visit Romania and watch television, I hardly notice any real information being given to viewers. It's simply a kind of discourse, usually oppositional, from which you actually can't take anything at all. and my colleague told me, we noticed this too, and we're analyzing these trends. And he calls it the destruction of journalistic language. When you hear something like that, at first it seemed exaggerated to me. The destruction of language. I mean, there's no more journalistic language. That's exaggerated. She's a colleague of mine who probably feels frustrated because we don't have a press that improves in quality and so on. But then if you really take a closer look, and that's what I'm doing now as a professional habit. When I come, I watch, for example, television and all kinds of shows. I actually notice this. In fact, that language we used to have doesn't exist anymore, not even in the very basic press we used to do in the 90s. We'd go after the editor-in-chief told us to report what we learned from the press conference, who, what, how. We would report exactly what we found out, very simple information, Reuters style that people needed to know. At the moment, in a lot of places, not saying in all Romanian media, but unfortunately in many, especially on television, the discourse, the journalistic language simply no longer exists. In many shows, if you watch from beginning to end, you don't actually have a channel of verified and simple information that answers basic questions that comes from the journalist to you. It's always information from others, restructured and reinterpreted. Many times I'm convinced it's influenced editorially by many factors. But this language, that one, simply the simple, clean journalistic language, I feel like it's disappearing. And once again, this is happening in many other countries. I feel like I see this a lot in the United States, for example, which still has a very good press, written press, well, now online. But when you get into broadcasting on television, you have this problem almost all the time. If you watch television in America, on a lot of shows, actually, at the end, you don't have any. If you try to condense it, in fact, you don't even have 1% of structured journalistic language.
And before we stop, I would like to ask you if you can tell us a simple action that those who are watching or listening to us can do this week, tomorrow, to support trustworthy information in Romania.
I think without philosophizing any further about the future of the press and what we expect to happen in the field of journalism, I think what people can do to support independent media is to support it financially. I think this is the biggest problem we see everywhere. Once again, even in many countries where you actually have very mature systems, everyone has this problem. Yeah, of course, it won't be solved tomorrow, but I think especially in the context of Romania, where you have very few media organizations that do their job and do it very well, I think it's the best thing I can do. And it's a very interesting thing. Sometimes I talk to people from Romania who aren't in the media field. They work in completely different areas, and we talk about the press. In a few cases, I was surprised to find out from them that actually everyone, the people I talk to, think that the press is paid from somewhere. You don't have a problem there. Journalists, since they appear on television or in the press or write something, have a salary, and usually everyone thinks that journalists have a very good salary and are doing very well. Never do people, once again, it's kind of an anecdote. It's not a generalized study, but I've met a lot of people who don't know how. The problem is who pays the journalists and what the mechanism is and how they do this. I think this is a phenomenon that should make us think. And once again, to answer very specifically the question of what they could do, I think this is the best thing they could do. Supporting the financial press is what they need right now.
Marius, is there something I haven't asked you that you would have wanted to say? No, asked, is there something?
No, not necessarily, no. Well, I could tell you many more things, but...
Well, then I say we should stop here. We thank Marius for coming, right, Ada?
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. And we hope that both we and the press will survive.
Yes, absolutely. Me too.
All right, then. Goodbye.
All the best. Thank you very much for the invitation.
You're welcome.